Madam President, how are you today? I would ask to officiate the quorum call.
Without objection. The question is on the Medine nomination.
As for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Harkin, Heitkamp, Klobuchar, Schatz, Udall of Colorado, and Udall of New Mexico. Senators voting in the negative: Blunt, Fisher, Grassley, Hatch, and Isaacson. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Corker, no. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Paul. No. Mr. Paul. No. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Tester? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Ms. Hirono? Aye. Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Roberts? Mr. Roberts? No. Mr. Vitter? No. Mr. McCain? Mr. McCain? No. Mr. Graham? No. Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mr. Crapo? No. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? Aye. Yes. Mr. Donnelly? Mr. Donnelly? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mr. Cruz? Mr. Cruz? No. Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Flake? Mr. Flake? No. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Coates? No. Mr. Coates? No. Mr. Shelby? No. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey. No. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Franken. Aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin. Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Aye. Mr. Wicker. No. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Aye. Ms. Landrieu. Aye. Mr. Scott. No. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. No. Mr. King. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Enzi. No. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer. Aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman. No. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk. No. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe. No. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan. Aye. Mr. Nelson. Aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill. Aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller. No. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte. No. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. No. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski. No. Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin. Aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller. Aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. No. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Cowan. Aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Hoeven. Mr. Hoeven, no. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johans, no. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 52, the nays 45, and the nomination is confirmed.
Madam President?
Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered, made, and laid on the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume their legislative session. Senator from Washington.
Madam President, I just wanted to talk for a moment. You know, I've heard a lot from my constituents that they are very tired of the dysfunction here in Washington, D.C. They're tired of political gridlock that impacts their businesses, their children's schools, their paychecks. And after spending last week with families and businesses that are impacted by sequestration in my home state of Washington, I know this is especially true right now. Madam President, when I became chair of the Senate Budget Committee, I said I hoped that Democrats and Republicans would be able to work together to end the cycle of governing from crisis to crisis and the attempts to negotiate budget policy through brinksmanship, which we have seen far too much of in recent years. I believe this goal is just as important today and is in fact more attainable, but we need Republicans to meet us at the table and proceed to conference under regular order. We are at a unique moment in our debate about the country's fiscal and economic challenges. Following the 2 years that the Bipartisan Budget Control Act took the place of a congressional budget, the Senate returned to regular order this year, and we passed a budget resolution. The House has also passed their budget, and the President weighed in with a proposal for his path moving forward. We now have an opportunity to move through regular order to try to get a bipartisan budget agreement, and we should seize it. Madam President, Democrats and Republicans have different perspectives on a wide variety of issues. But just a few months ago, it seemed that Democrats and Republicans did agree on at least one thing: the budget debate should proceed through regular order. Democrats chose to move forward with a budget resolution through committee and said that an open process through regular order was the best way to reach bipartisan agreement. And Republicans agreed. They said that once the Senate and House passed budgets, quote, the work of conferencing must begin. They said that a conference was, and I quote, the best vehicle for the budget debate because we're doing it in plain sight. And they said we needed the open public debate that regular order requires. In fact, Senator McConnell said Senate Democrats should, and I quote, return to regular order and transparency in the legislative process. The Obama administration has also said regular order is the way to proceed. But, Madam President, Senate Republicans have now blocked our efforts to move to conference not once but twice. Some Republicans said they want to negotiate a framework behind closed doors before going to conference. But that's what a budget is. It's a framework that lays out our values and our priorities and helps us plan for the country's future. And I think that framework is exactly what we ought to be debating in a formal and public conference, and there's no reason to wait. Now, I know this isn't going to be easy. There are vast differences between the Senate and the House budgets and the visions that we each present. But I believe we will be most effective at resolving these differences if we have time for open debate and discussion and opportunities to identify common ground. Waiting until the last minute is not a good option. The uncertainty that is caused in the lead-up to every manufactured crisis over the past 2 years has hurt our businesses, it has hurt our economy, and it is threatening our fragile economic recovery. It keeps us from planning and investing in our future, and it makes Americans question whether or not their government is capable of solving any problems that confront us. Now, I know, and we all know, there are extreme elements in our political system that think compromise is a dirty word. I know some Republicans think they don't have the political space to make a bipartisan deal until the very last minute of a crisis. But I believe that many of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle here want to return to regular order and move us away from the constant crisis. And I'm hoping that the voices of reason win, because American families and our businesses expect us to do better than running down the clock. So I urge my Republican colleagues to join us now in proceeding to conference through regular order, as they have said we should. That is the best way to reach a deal that is the best and most responsible path for our country to move forward on. So, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 33, H-Con Res 25, that the amendment, which is at the desk, the text of S-Con Res 8, the budget resolution passed by the Senate, be inserted in lieu thereof, that H-Con Res 25 as amended be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, that the Senate insist on its amendment, request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and the chair be authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate, all with no intervening action or debate.
Madam President, would the senator yield for a question? Is a question in order?
There is a UC before the Senate. If no one objects, I would be happy to answer a question.
Okay. Well, reserving the right to object, which I'm not going to do, but I just want to clarify the senator's motion. You're simply asking us to move the budget, which you passed after a heroic effort on the part of many to pass a budget so that we could move to regular order. Your amendment, your consent, is only asking us to move with all due speed to a conference to resolve the differences between the House budget and the Senate budget. Is that your understanding?
The senator from Louisiana is correct. The UC that I'm requesting simply takes us to conference so the House and the Senate members can agree, Republicans and the Democrats alike, to work towards a bipartisan solution.
One more question. Aren't there Republicans represented on that committee? In fact, would the Republicans have the majority representation from the House?
Parliamentary inquiry. We're making a speech here, or are we considering objecting to a consent request?
The Senate.
Is there objection to the request?
Reserving the right to object, I would ask consent that the senator modify her request so that it not be in order for the Senate to consider a conference report that includes tax increases or reconciliation instructions to increase taxes or raise the debt ceiling.
Is there objection?
Madam President, reserving the right to object, and I will in a moment. We considered over 100 amendments on the floor. All of those kinds of amendments were brought up, debated, and considered as part of the resolution, as we do on any debate. So there's no need to go back and redo all of our amendments again. So I would object and ask simply again our UC to move forward to conference so we can discuss all of these issues in regular order.
Objection is noted. Is there objection to the original request?
I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President,
Senator from Louisiana.
can I be heard for 3 minutes on this subject?
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, this is very disturbing that the minority leader has objected taking the budget to conference, because it's the only way to get a compromise on the budget is to take it to conference, as the chair of the Budget Committee has asked us to do, to work out the differences between the Republican version of the budget and the Democratic version of the budget. Right now, President Obama has some ideas about what his budget would look like. The Democrats and Republicans passed a budget here. The Republicans have passed a budget on the House side. The only way to work that out is following the leadership of the chairman of the Budget Committee, who is a senior member now of this body, who understands
regular order, understands the art of compromise, understands that there's a Democratic-controlled Senate, a Republican-controlled House, and a Democratic president, all who have legitimate but varying views about how the budget should be worked out. May I say, a very important subject, Madam President, for the people of the United States, because we're running deficits as far as the eye can see, and while we've made some progress in cutting substantially, and we have raised some revenues, it's important to get our budget better in balance so that we can grow this economy, keep this recovery going, stop throwing cold water on the recovery that is underway, and help Americans get jobs and create business. I am flabbergasted to hear that the minority leader has just said no to that plan. Said no. We're not going to conference. We object unless you do X, Y, and Z. It's always a objection, a but. You know, Democrats could come to this floor and say the same thing, Madam President. I don't want to go to conference unless we decide we cannot, under any circumstance, even talk about Medicaid or Social Security or cutting education or health care. We won't go to conference unless we put that on the table. You'll never get to conference if both sides dig in before the discussions can even begin. That's where we are, and I can understand the majority leader's frustration, and I most certainly appreciate the leadership of the Budget Committee chair, and I am just so sorry to see that the chairman of the Budget Committee cannot even get the budget to conference to begin the debate on compromise because of this, non-regular order status that the Republican minority, led by the senator from Texas, of course, but reiterated by the senator from Kentucky.
Madam President, I thank the senator from Louisiana, and I just have to say I am really frustrated and shocked at the reaction of our Republican counterparts who have repeatedly said to the Senate, you need to pass a budget. And we did so under regular order, and everyone will remember the night we spent here till 5 a.m. going through hundreds of amendments, the ones that the majority leader just objected to that he wanted guarantees on before we went to conference. We voted on all those amendments. That's what this process is all about. How can I, as budget chairman, now do what the country is asking us to do, which is to compromise, move forward, and solve our problems rather than managing by crisis? If we can't go to conference, how are we going to get a budget agreement moving forward? Everyone in this country knows this debate. It's gone on for several years. It went through the super committee. It went through an election where people's voices were heard. And now, after just berating us for not having a budget, the Senate Republicans are saying, well, that didn't matter. We don't care if you have a budget. We're just going to sit here. Madam President, that kind of chaos is exactly what this country does not need when it comes to our fragile economy today and people are trying to get back on their feet. I am ready to go to work. I'm ready to sit down with Republican leadership from the Budget Committee in the House and their conferees to put our ideas on the table and to make some tough choices. But I can't do it until the Senate Republicans quit objecting to us going to conference to get that done. So, third time we've asked, third time we've been turned down. We're going to keep trying to get this done, Madam President. I am committed to solving one of the biggest problems facing our country. Give us certainty, get us back on track, but I can't do it when the Republicans are objecting to allow us to go to conference. So I'm very disappointed, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.
And as you heard, the Senate's in recess now to allow members to attend their weekly party meetings. Before gaveling out, they confirmed David Medine as the chair of the Privacy and Liberties Oversight Board, and the vote on that was 52 to 45. When lawmakers return at 2:15, they'll start work on a water projects bill authorizing the Army Corps of Engineers to work on a number of flood protection and water supply projects. Work on the bill is expected to take up the rest of the week. Of course, we'll have live coverage of the Senate when they return here on C-SPAN 2, and again, that'll be at 2:15 Eastern. News from the Defense Department today. The Associated Press writing that officials say a new Pentagon study report says that the